Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I am Andrew Petiprin, joined by Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. It's been quite a while, so it's good to be back doing this.
It has been a while. We took a little bit of a break. We've both been very busy over Christmas, and now here we are in mid-January, finally pressing the start button again to resume these wonderful conversations that we've been having. And I'm excited about today's conversation, Bobby. We're going to be talking with Roy Peachey, who is the author of many articles and books, including Travels in Radical Christianity, which is, I think, the book we're going to talk about the most today. Does that sound good to you, Bobby?
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to delving into this. Roy and I, we've been connected over the years back when we were working at Word on Fire, and Roy's. We'll get into this eventually, but your work on education is phenomenal. So looking forward to this.
Well, I'll let you go ahead and throw it to Roy first, but let me first of all just welcome Roy to the program. Roy Peachey, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Thank you ever so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and chatting to you today.
Yeah, Roy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just pick up from here. The your book. We're actually having this podcast because of your recently published book through Angelico Press called "Travels in Radical Christianity." I've read the book and I was just I really liked how you set things up as a kind of like almost like a travel log, but exploring these intentional communities. So maybe could you say a little bit about what inspired you to write such a book?
Yeah, I suppose the same reason I've written all my books, really, that I had a question or questions that I didn't know the answer to. And so part of the process of exploring was by writing a book about it, which I know is a slightly unconventional way of going about things. So I stumbled across various radical groups in one way or another, countercultural groups, I suppose, and I was intrigued by their lives. The Benedict option obviously had made a bit of a stir when that was published as well, and I'd read that and had been really interested by it. And I felt myself drawn in two directions, I guess. In some ways, I found that I was getting more radical the older I got, rather than the opposite. But in another way, I was also rather cautious of some of the claims that were being made about cultural Christianity, about some of these radical groups. So I thought the fairest thing to do would literally to get out and explore, to go on a pilgrimage in effect and visit lots of different groups and to go with a really positive spirit and think, what can I learn from these groups? There may be theological differences. There were theological differences a lot of the time, but there was a sense as well that actually I've got quite a lot to learn still. And I wondered what the ordinary Christian in the pew had to learn from those groups, and usually it was groups or communities who had stepped outside the mainstream, who were living in a intentional countercultural way.
You know what was interesting, Roy, looking at your book, it occurred to me, the word reality popped up a lot, or the real. And something that Bobby and I have talked about a lot and that I've experienced in my own travels and in my own work is, there's this false presumption that some people have that, going on a pilgrimage or going and spending time with a group like, the Bruderhof or, whatever it may be, that's some kind of escapism, that's fleeing from reality. That's getting away from, normal everyday things, which it is getting away from normal everyday things. But I think what you convey in your book, and I'd love to just hear you say more about this, is that that's actually where the real is more real in a way. Like, when you encounter these people and when you go to these places, you experience something more solid.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the Bruderhof are a really interesting example. So for those people listening in who might not have come across the Bruderhof before, they are a very small group. There's about 300 of them, 3,000 of them worldwide. They are Anabaptists, and you don't come across Anabaptists very often in the 21st century. And in the UK, they had three different communities. I think it's down to two communities now. And I suppose the closest we might have to them is the Amish. It's that sort of approach. They are living They dress differently from the people around them. They are very much coming out of that 16th century radical Protestant tradition. So in some ways, very, very different from the Catholic tradition of which I am proudly a part. Uh, but what I found really interesting about the Bruderhof were a couple of things, really. One was that they are really working very hard to live in community. And living in community is difficult. I don't think it's straightforward at all. And so they talked a lot about this idea that that was bringing them up against the real. The real was, how do you cope with other people in the community who think differently from you, who might rub you up the wrong way, who are not necessarily easy to get on with? How do we build a community that genuinely works? And so that's about confronting the real. And then the other thing that really stands out about them is their attitude towards technology, which is really interesting. So they have a very deliberate stance where they do not have technology in the homes. There are no radios, there is no TV, there are no mobile phones. They really keep technology out of the home. So they sound like they are, they've got these Luddite tendencies, but they've also got on site factory, which is a state of the art factory where they use the latest of technology. They produce Plough magazine, which is a very, very good magazine, beautifully presented, beautifully produced, drawing on a very wide range of writers, including lots of very good Catholic writers. And so what they're doing is they're saying, actually, let's really think about how we work with technology, what technology does to us, what technology does to children, when and where it's appropriate. And so they've thought that through, I think, in a way that is quite unusual and unusually profound. And they do that because they know this is another way in which they're confronting the real. They're just not mindless naysayers. They're not simply turning their backs on the modern world at all, but they aren't also doing the opposite, which is simply saying, well, we'll accept whatever is thrown at us. We'll accept whatever the latest trend is. And that's the Bruderhof. But of course, you've got this very similar sort of thing going on with the Franciscans of the Renewal and with all sorts of other communities.
Yeah, in your book, you stress the intentional living, intentional Christianity, and it's you bring up technology there. It's amazing how so many of us we end up kind of conforming to just accepting a technology that has a certain intention that ends up shaping us in a way, and so we live in a different intentional way. I know some people out here in Poland who were really inspired. You brought up Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. And so they tried to kind of create something like that. But the funny thing is that they all were part of a signal group. And what's really interesting is that instead of, you mentioned that the real is being like having to deal with people that you've got in the community, the people that you like, the people that you don't like so much. And like learning how to resolve conflicts. Well, there's some conflicts I know between these, and not to get into this too much, but it was being resolved through Signal, which was interesting because that was exact opposite of how this should have probably been happening. But it's almost as if the technology itself was creating even more and more problems, but nobody was discussing this. So maybe, I mean, I don't want to like go too far in this on this topic, but it's so interesting that that the technology, this intentional way of technology. Could you say a little bit more about perhaps why a lot of these communities are, when you say radical, they also have a certain, say, careful approach to the various technologies and mediums that they use?
I suppose this is something I wrote about a long time ago when I was writing about education and about the importance of embodied education. And I think we are still very much caught up in this Cartesian dualism. We think of ourselves, what really matters is the mind, and the body's a sort of slightly inconvenient add on. And that's just not the Catholic view at all. And yet it's so deeply embedded in our culture that we we get dragged along with it. And I think when that's applied to technology, we the two also almost inevitably come into conflict at times. So, just to take a really simple example, we get tired because we are embodied beings. And therefore, when we're particularly tired, we veg out in front of the television or we find ourselves scrolling through meaningless content on our phones. And so I think as soon as we start to take ourselves seriously as mind body composites, or however we want to describe it, as whole beings, whole people, then that automatically gets us to think about technology in another way. I think there's also that sense that we are, we grow through time. So children are still finding their way in the world, fairly obviously. Teenagers are still grappling with all sorts of issues. So when then technology is thrown into the mix, it confuses things in a fairly dramatic way. So when I was teaching and when I was working in schools, you saw that eventually we got to the point where the teacher was really third in the pecking order. Who were the students really interested in learning from? They're interested in learning from each other. Peer pressure is extremely powerful. And then they're learning from TikTok or whatever is being fed into their phones. And then thirdly, they might grudgingly listen to their teacher. But actually, teachers are, they're old. What do they really know? So I think there's an issue there about when we introduce technology. And then there's the whole side of things which Neil Postman and a whole bunch of people have written about, where that sense that technology is not neutral. It it has the medium is the message. So it is impossible. Twitter or X inevitably dumbs things down because of its length, because of the way it's presented, and that's just one example. So that doesn't mean that any of these things should be shunned totally, but it does mean they should be used carefully and they should be used in a way which ultimately helps us become more human and more real. And that's where we've got to learn sometimes. The Bruderhof say sometimes you've just got to learn when to say no, when to stop. That's the fourth principle, really. There are various other principles. That's the ultimate, press the red button, just okay, we need to stop now. But that actually is actually one of the ones where we find really difficult to put into practice.
Roy, I want to come back to some of the places you've been, but I want to carry this thread a little bit farther because there's a lot of good stuff in your book and in other things you've written about. You mentioned things that you've written about education, and I think this really connects up that if we're thinking in terms of what is the end, the telos of education, then we can think about how technology may be a part of it. But if the end of education is something like, flourishing or wisdom, right? Then the teacher is indispensable in a way that technology is very, frankly, very dispensable. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think if we think of the end of education as being wisdom rather than knowledge, knowledge is obviously hugely important, but wisdom as being the ultimate end, human flourishing, eudaimonia, however you want to describe it, then the relationship between teacher and student, between parent and child, between friend and friend, becomes of paramount importance. And I think in some ways, actually, we are in a better place now than we were a few years ago because everybody realized during the COVID crisis that actually online learning wasn't that great. And they really craved human companionship. They wanted to be in the same room as other people. Didn't necessarily explain why they wanted to do that, but they felt it. It was very palpable. So I think there's that very powerful sense that we always need to go back to the end of education. What is the telos of education? I think that's so important. And yet my experience teaching in schools for many, many years was that it was a question that was almost never asked. It's so easy to get caught up into what's in the specification, what's in the syllabus, what have I got to get through this term, or I've got this huge pile of essays to mark, rather than thinking actually, what's this all for? Where's it all leading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually today I had to submit all of my reports. And the students, it always kind of, rubs me the wrong way when the students who actually are quite smart and that, but they don't really engage in class, or they check out, they might not even show up to class. Um, and they just ask you, they're the ones who are the most concerned about what's their grade. And so that's what they finally participate in class or ask me a question about their grade. But you can kind of see like the students sometimes that I really like is the one who actually doesn't care, probably should care a little bit more about the grade, but is just there and also and asks a ton of questions. There's a certain like awe and wonder in them that, I think animates any teacher, but the way it's set up is just about like literally what's in the curriculum, what do we have to learn, okay, ultimately what's the grade, and then it's always a means to some other end, um, and so it actually frightens me because we had a talk last week about artificial intelligence, and students using this because in this program they have to write all these extended essays and then they have to do an internal, essay too. And anyways, the it's really hard to detect whether or not they're using um, AI, because they can even get around the checkers now. It's like, how do you grade a paper that says, oh, it's 20% AI or it's, 40%. But anyways, and so some of the teachers are saying, well, maybe we just need to maybe they'll just get rid of actually writing essays eventually. But anyways, and one of the teachers said, well, the teacher of the future is there just to encourage the student, and the technology will just do the job. And so I felt like the job of the teacher is maybe just to press the play button and to encourage all the students to just attend to the video. So yeah, it seems that we've moved far away from this, where you really are in some ways doing something like an apprenticeship with the teacher. Um, so could you say, when you were going in these communities, what was the education, even the formative experience like for a number of them? Even something behind the Bruderhof, you mentioned the Franciscans of the Renewal. Was there anything that you found quite interesting in how they were educating but also forming their communities?
Yeah, I mean, lots of different ways in the different groups. So one of the groups that was very interesting was the Manquehue group, which emerged out of Chile. And the guy who set this up was going through a very difficult time. Personally, he was really struggling with lots of questions. And he ended up talking to a Benedictine monk. And the Benedictine monk listened to his questions and then, to his really great surprise, opened Bible and said, "Okay, let's do some Lectio." And all the answers were found through Lectio Divina. And he went back to this monk for 3 years. This program of kind of sorting out his personal problems took 3 years, and just that incredible patience. And out of this emerged this new community, the Manquehue community, which puts Lectio Divina right at the heart of their educational work. It started on a fairly small scale in Chile. It's now spread to the UK. So several of the Benedictine schools in the UK have received members of the Manquehue community. And what they do is they simply work on Lectio with the children, and also enabling the older students to do Lectio with the younger students as well. So you get a very different sort of peer pressure. So I thought that was really interesting. There's a real sense of going back to the sources. Um, and one of the books that they recommend for all new members of the community is St. Elred's book on spiritual friendship, which I think I found is extraordinary. And the rule of St. Benedict is right at the heart of everything they do. So often our reading begins at, I don't know, 1850 if you're lucky. The idea that here's this community recommending St. Aelred to as a mainstream text to its members is incredible. And then I wrote a chapter all about home education as well, and looked at various different home educating groups, some Protestant, some Catholic, and often they are doing precisely what we talked about earlier. They're really thinking about the end of education. They're thinking about wisdom as well as knowledge. They're going back to some of the ideas of classical liberal education, often inspired by Dorothy L. Sayers' take on all of this and thinking about the different stages of learning, equating to the trivium. So in a sense, I don't think I came across a silver bullet and saying, okay, that's definitely the way we should be doing it. But almost to be asking the questions at all, almost to be asking, what do we want out of this education? What do we want for our children or our students? Sets people off on the right path. Whereas the temptation is so often just to say, well, I'll put them in the local school and they can sort out the problem. It's difficult bringing up children. It's difficult being a parent. It's difficult being an educator. So if you can slightly hand over the problem to someone else, that's quite comforting.
Well, it's very good of you to explore these questions because, as Bobby was talking a moment ago about, his students who are interested in what marks they get, but not necessarily what content they're, or what wisdom they're growing in or whatever. I was remembering a part in your book, and I admit I haven't read your book as closely as I should have, but there was a part that I encountered where you talk about how even the kind of modern notion of getting a mark, getting a grade for some work that you do in an academic setting is quite a modern way of doing things. It wasn't at all the way people were once educated. So I don't know. Do you think we're kind of in a moment where we're rethinking the whole system? I know it's little by little, but I'm somewhat encouraged that maybe people like you but others too are like finally asking questions that are beginning to trickle out a little bit into the culture where people are stopping and thinking like, wait, why are we doing it this way again? Oh, it's just because we've just done it this way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a Neil Postman idea. And I remember reading that for the first time in Technopoly, his great book, and just being amazed by this idea that he says, the idea that this essay is an A minus or a C plus would have been completely meaningless to Shakespeare or Jefferson or Galileo, utterly meaningless. It is a relatively recent innovation from a very obscure, I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge Don, but we've got to blame one of the two of them. And yet it's become so powerfully embedded in everything we do. And as you say, it's the first thing that students turn to is the mark. That's tends to be the obsession. How do you get out of that? There's a really interesting article in the Plough magazine, actually by an enclosed nun who writes about curiositas and studiositas, and why curiosity was traditionally seen as a sin. Why is that seen as a problematic? Because curiosity, surely that's a good thing. But she distinguishes between curiosity and the awe and wonder that Bobby talked about a minute ago. They're very different things. And that idea of, what is studiositas? Well, as soon as you translate it into English, it sounds, who wants to be studious? That's not that appealing to a 16-year-old. But actually, again, that's not originally what it means. It is about that engagement with the whole of reality. And you can be engaged with the whole of reality in all sorts of different ways, not simply by reading a book, although that's a perfectly good way of being engaged with reality as well. So I think that my feeling in the UK, and maybe this is a UK issue, is you have got lots of people who are really thinking about these issues, but they're not necessarily in contact with each other. I think there are lots of groups who are kind of finding their way and almost beginning again from scratch. So there's lots of encouragement there, but I think we're still very much on the way. And in many ways, we're quite inspired by what's been going on in the States for many years. I know that the situation is far from perfect, but there are lots of good things on which people can draw. So I talk about, in these Travels in Radical Christianity, I say that the home education option is a very radical one in the UK, much more so than in the US. Um, but that has it's a growing movement. It's definitely a growing movement for all sorts of different reasons. And
Yeah,
that itself brings challenges, but I think a lot of hope as well.
Yeah, your book, I mean, out of the classroom and into the world, I mean, is really, I mean, a great resource. I recommend it to all teachers and even, parents, home educators. I remember just drawing from so many of those resources, and I believe you also have some background in studying the Lake District as well. And so I'm just fascinated by this because Andrew and we're both, I mean, we both feel like at heart we're romantics, but in the sense of this, just basically finding a lot of the, if you want to say, I don't know how best to describe our romanticism, Andrew. Do you want to describe it for me, or I mean, it,
Yeah, who's romanticism, right?
yeah, who's
Yes, I mean,
romanticism?
well, I mean, I think romanticism as a kind of reaction to the Industrial Revolution and a kind of,
Yeah,
some sense that we were, as we move into modernity, we're, casting aside kind of the old or just sort of ignoring what we're standing upon, the kind of very ground of being or something like that, I think undergirds the kind of romantic vision that I like. But I don't
yeah.
know, I'll throw it back to you. You were building
Yeah,
up
but
to a
well, I
question
mean,
for
it
Roy.
just for to think about all those figures that went out to the Lake District, and then to think about some of these prominent figures like John Ruskin and William Morris of the 19th century England, and then out here in Poland, you have the Romantic movement, but you also have some late 19th, early 20th century figures like Szczepanski, those who went into the Tatra Mountains and we're trying to retrieve some of the focal ways, but just attending to like what's already around them and not trying to create this universal, almost mechanical culture. Could you say, I mean, something a little bit about that? How maybe those studies of like the Lake District and perhaps maybe how does that come to bear on your approach to education, but even with your desire to study these radical communities.
Yes, I tend to collect university qualifications, but probably the strangest of them all is my postgraduate certificate in Lake District Studies from Lancaster University. So I used to live on the outskirts of the English Lake District, and that was my very first teaching job, in fact. And so I took this course at Lancaster University, and we once a week we would go to the university and we'd sit in the seminar room and we'd have a discussion. It was all very interesting, but very often we had weekends out on the fells, and they were fantastic. I mean, the English Lake District, I mean, it rains all the time. So you were constantly getting completely soaked. But we had these wonderful weekends where we were learning about the botany, the geology, the history, and so on of the Lake District. We were learning through the soles of our feet, as one writer puts it. And I really liked that. So I think it was just experiential that this course, I loved doing this course. I learned a huge amount from it, but it was the way in which we were studying as much as what we were studying that mattered. And I think that sense of um, starting where we are can be really important. So, Wordsworth was going home. He wasn't actually fleeing to the countryside in a sense. He was simply coming back to where he'd been born. And I think so often we can start literally where we are. So, I taught on the North Downs in the UK, which is this beautiful chalk downland. And I would take my students outside. I mean, that in itself was quite radical. I almost had to pretend I wasn't doing that to the school authorities because you have to have lessons inside, good Cartesian way. But I'd take my students outside and say to them, what's under your feet? And quite often they did not know what the geology was. They had no idea that there was chalk under their feet. Okay, let's think about what that means. Let's think about how that has affected the landscape, what you see in front of you. How's that affected the botany, what's growing in front of you? So I think there's one sense in which actually these journeys are really important, but actually in the end, we've got to come back home. And what we do when we're back home and what we do when we've got, what's right outside our doorstep. And I think this really came home to me during lockdown, during the COVID epidemic. Um, and one of the very simple things we did was we just went down our street and we tried to name all of the trees that we saw. Can I actually identify the trees just outside my door that I walk past every day? And the answer at first was no, we couldn't, but we could by the end of lockdown. And so I think that can be really important. And I think it how does this tie in with the whole travels in radical Christianity? I think often you need to journey in order to come back and appreciate what you've got right there in front of you. And I think sometimes you have to give things up to see what's important. What you're gonna, what can you, what what are you going to take back once you've given it up, and what are you going to give up for good? So there are lots of different ways in which this applies. As for romanticism, I have kind of mixed feelings about the English romantics, I have to say. I think there are some very interesting writers who came later. And I think the romantics were coming at that point where the Industrial Revolution had raised all sorts of new questions. And there's this pot of ideas boiling away, and they're not quite sure how to fix themselves anymore. I'm mixing my metaphors horribly. But Wordsworth, who of course changed as well as he grew older, his views changed quite radically in some ways. So Wordsworth and his disciples are trying to work out what does it mean now to be living in an industrial and post-industrial Britain. And I think that is still a lively question, in many parts of the world.
Yeah, certainly. Roy, something you were talking about before reminded me of wanting to go back to just sort of talking about the genesis of the book, The Travels in Radical Christianity, because you're talking about going out and just, noticing the ground beneath your feet and the birds and the trees and all that sort of thing. You talked about the things that you noticed in the communities that you went to. But I'm curious, there's a lot in the book about your own growth, your own formation. It's like it's your own journey in faith too. So I'm wondering, like, there was one part in particular that jumped out at me when you're talking about going to Spain to the pilgrimage route and treating it at first just like a kind of bike holiday, and but encountering more. And I wonder if you could just talk about that, just what these travels mean to you and like have meant to you in your faith journey.
Yeah, well, I grew up in this very vaguely Anglican atmosphere, I guess, in a very British way. That uh, my our family didn't really go to church, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. Um, so there's that sense that, but we went to the local primary school, I was christened, and so on. So I grew up with this sort of vaguely Christian culture. And then at university, I became a sort of determined evangelical, an evangelical Anglican, and was very involved in the church there. And after university, I went off and worked for an evangelical charity in a night shelter. And then I went and did my first job, and suddenly life seemed a bit more complicated, and I didn't really know where I was. So part of what was happening at that time was I was invited by a friend, a Spanish friend, to go on the Camino, the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. But I had no idea. I had absolutely no comprehension of what this meant at all. So for me, it was a cycling holiday. We were going to cycle the route. For him, it was a pilgrimage. And then I mean, looking back, I'm just utterly embarrassed now. When we got to Santiago, I had no interest in the tomb of St. James. I had I had no comprehension that actually that physical journey could be linked with some sort of internal spiritual journey as well. Whereas much later, when I then became a Catholic, and some of the most important moments in my faith journey and my growth in faith have come when I've been on pilgrimage, going to Altötting in Germany, where Joseph Ratzinger was born, and or near where he was born, and going to Rome, going to Lourdes. These have been really significant moments. So I think there's that sense in which the external needs to meet the internal, and what's going on in the outside world can have very, very different impacts on the individual. And it's how we join those up for individuals. So I just thought, look, I've got to be honest in this book that I can't speak for everybody. This is my journey, and it may or may not speak to other people, or maybe some parts of it will speak to other people and others won't. So, and as I say, in some ways, I thought the only way in which I can explore here is by exploring myself and asking the questions that I didn't know the answers to.
Yeah, the theme of pilgrimage. I mean, that's why we would like to eventually, host people around Europe and take them on these journeys. The you said the external, then influencing the eternal internal. It seems, when you look at like a map of Europe, I saw like right here in Poland, there's actually the Saint the Camino extends all the way here, and you find actual the what's the symbol of the shell? You find these routes all over. And I remember a couple of years ago, my wife was in her hometown in northeast Poland, so almost in Lithuania, and she saw a guy just walking on the side of the road with a backpack. And like they're asking him, "Are you making your way to Our Lady of Czestochowa?" Jasna, where most Poles in August, many of them do that pilgrimage from around Poland. And he said, "No, I'm going all the way to the Camino." And a year later, my wife, I'm not making this up, she saw the same guy in her hometown, and she asked him, "Oh my gosh, so did you make it?" He says, Yes, I did. It took me such a long time, but he did it." And so it seems like, like I grew up next to Muslim neighbors, and I remember hearing from them for the first time that like it was part of being a Muslim that they had to go to Mecca if they had the means to do that. And I was so touched by that it gave them like an orientation, the physical in some ways, like you said, the external influence the eternal internal. So yes, I just want to comment on that. I think that's beautiful. But you mentioned in your book, kind of switching here, you mentioned radical orthodoxy because I remember when you said in your own journey when um, right after college, and then when you started working, you met Tracy Rowland, who we have had on the podcast before, and then I think you met Allison um, Milbank, um, and we had John Milbank on not too long ago as well. So I was very influenced in late college, reading that blue book, The Radical Orthodoxy. Could you say a little bit about your connection with them?
Yeah, well, I started a PhD at the JP2 Institute in Melbourne
Hmm.
under the supervision of Tracy Rowland, which was fantastic, obviously. And then sadly, when the institute closed, I then had to make a decision. What do I do now? So I carried on with my doctoral studies in Britain at Nottingham with Alison Milbank as my supervisor. So I'd moved from, you know, Tracy, who's this incredible thinker and writer in the radical Orthodox tradition, to Nottingham, which is really the epicenter of radical Orthodoxy in the UK. Alison Milbank, John Milbank, and so on. So yeah, I've been incredibly blessed to have been taught by these wonderful people and supervised by these wonderful teachers. And I think the radical orthodoxy movement is very interesting in all sorts of different ways because, in a sense, it's unashamedly intellectual. It says, look, ideas do matter, and what we think about God really matters. And therefore, when our ideas about God and the relationship of God and man go wrong, and they identify that moment in time as being Duns Scotus being a particularly kind of key time, and it's all a bit complicated why they argue that. But once we get those ideas go awry, then all sorts of things follow from that and cause problems. So they are working on an act of recovery. And a lot of it is about recovering this idea of participation in the life of God as being absolutely central to what we do as Christians. And I think that has not always been at the center of our theological concerns, and I think it probably should be. And then leading on from that the whole idea of divinization, theosis, that idea of becoming gods. I mean, just to say it, it sounds, I mean, how radical an idea is that? Again, it's there in Western theology, but it's not been as prominent as it has remained in Eastern Christianity. So then they've started, all sorts of different areas that the Millbanks and others have been interested in. So Alison Millbank has lectured at, Cambridge in literature and in theology. So they're constantly thinking across all of these artificial boundaries that we set up. Awful lot of work on post-liberal politics. There's work on economic, all sorts of areas radical orthodox thinkers talk about. And John Milbank had this wonderful way of introducing himself to his students at Cambridge when they'd have their initial meeting and they'd go around the room and each academic would introduce him or herself and say what their area of specialism was. And John would say, I'm interested in God and in all things in relation to God.
Mhm.
So and in a sense, that's what we should all be aspiring to, isn't it? Rather than saying, actually, I am a theologian or I am an artist or a scientist. We, modern education, the modern way of thinking is all about breaking things down into discrete chunks, which then have nothing to do with each other. And and in a sense, I think our job as educators, writers, thinkers, creative people is to try and bring all of these things back together because that's how they are meant to be.
Yeah, and do you think, Roy, I think that your use of the word radical in the title of your book is really important and your discussion of it throughout. Um, you know, I think that this is a big challenge for Christians today, is just how to live the radical nature of the gospel. The demands that it makes upon us are very serious. And I think that you see in some of the groups that you visited and that you write about in your book, this attempt to live the radical nature of the gospel. That having been said, most of us don't live that way. We live out in the world. And I guess, my just enduring question these days is just how to take the gospel seriously in its full radical nature and also go about living, in the world. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that. Just kind of, you do get into it in your book, but I think our listeners would be interested.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, partly it's thinking about what radical means, which is going back to the roots, isn't it? Is what are the roots of everything that we do. But I think we can over intellectualize it. So I've got one chapter in the book about Barry and Margaret Mizzen, with this incredibly ordinary but incredibly inspiring couple who live in South London in the UK. Very ordinary. So Barry he had a shoe repair business. Margaret was a stay-at-home mum. They've got lots of children, and they would not have been on anybody's radar at all if it had not been for the fact that their son Jimmy was murdered the day after his 16th birthday. This terrible, unprovoked attack in London. And it could have been sadly, just another homicide, just another statistic. But they were interviewed by the BBC the next day, and Margaret talked about how she was thinking about how the murderer's mum was thinking. And very quickly, they were talking about forgiveness. And they have since dedicated their lives to a project of forgiveness, peace, and hope. So this ties in very nicely with the Space Alvey Institute, obviously. And they go around and they talk to all sorts of groups, schools, the police, and others as well, about this in a very down to earth and a very ordinary way. But what I find particularly inspiring about the Mizzens is that they were as surprised as anybody else when they heard these words coming out of their mouth when they spoke to the BBC. And Margaret says, "Look, if you'd asked me a week before what my response would have been if someone had murdered my son, it wouldn't have been what I actually said. But there was that moment of grace for her." And she said on the day that her son was murdered, she went up into her room. There were lots and lots of people who come to their house to comfort them, but she just needed a moment of quiet. And she had that sort of reassurance that Jimmy was in heaven. And she promised him there and then that she would dedicate the rest of her life to keeping his name alive and to this work of justice and peace. Um, and so sometimes I think, what am I saying? I'm saying that it's not necessarily a program here. Sometimes there is this sense in which actually just these moments, sometimes the moments of real difficulty in our lives, when that moment of grace comes and we can accept it or we don't accept it.
Yeah, it's
There's a
amazing, isn't it? Like when you see, you sometimes have these moments when, you might have been a Christian your whole life, and then you see someone actually do something like that, where they're really living it. And I'm taken aback by it and convicted of it. I just think like, Lord, I mean, is what I say real in the way that I'm seeing it in these people's lives? Because you can see it can actually be applied. It doesn't have to just be theoretical, that there are people out there who are really doing it. So that's just fascinating. And yeah, sometimes it's so unexpected. It's just some outpouring of grace that even they don't know is going to be expressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I work for Mary's Meals now, which is this incredible
Oh
charity,
yeah.
a wonderful, wonderful charity. But it was started by a Scottish fish farmer called Magnus MacFarlane Barrow, who was a university dropout. He was living in a tiny little village in the middle of Scotland. And it all began when he saw a news report about the Bosnian War. And he went down the pub with his brother that night, and they simply asked themselves, what can we do? And just asking that question then changed all sorts of people's lives. So they took a week off work and they delivered aid to Bosnia, got back home to find that people were still sending them aid, which they were storing in their shed in their garden. So he never went back to work as a fish farmer, went 23 times to Bosnia with bigger and bigger lorries of aid, and then eventually ended up, after doing all sorts of other things in Malawi, where he met a family who was suffering because of famine and the AIDS epidemic that was sweeping through the country at that time. And again, he just asked a really simple question of the 14-year-old lad in that family. And he said, what are your ambitions in life? And the boy, Edward, said to him, I want to have enough to eat and I'd like to be able to go to school one day. Really simple, simple ambition. And that really hit Magnus hard. So he then started to feed children in their places of education, in their schools, 200 children in Malawi initially. Now, Mary's Meals is feeding over 2.4 million children across 16 different countries around the world. And so you've got this very ordinary person coming out of a family of very great faith. Actually, I think the very devout family, is important. But what he does is he responds to a need. And, you know, 20 years later, he finds that, he's feeding 2.5 million children every day. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, but it's coming from a very, it's coming from a very ordinary place. And we can look back on the Gospels, we can look back on the scriptures and see that actually the people who are doing extraordinary things are very ordinary.
So Roy, like looking at all of the communities that you visited and the individuals that you met, um, which one did you feel most attracted to?
Well, it's a difficult question. Um, I mean, there were all sorts. I met all sorts of wonderful people. So there's a wonderful um, Franciscan sister who had skated in the Olympics at the age of 17, and then turned her back on Olympic success and become this incredibly positive, incredibly inspiring Franciscan sister of the renewal. So meeting people like her was wonderful. Um, I but then in some ways it was people who were very close to home as well. So a youth worker in a parish in London who was doing remarkable things with teenagers in her parish setting, and inspiring others. Georgia Clark, that's again just very inspiring. Chatting to her about very practical issues about how we can renew our parishes as well. Um, and in a sense, I wouldn't want to tie it down. I felt that even when I had theological differences, even when I didn't agree with all of the positions that some of these groups were taking, I was always learning something from them, and I was always inspired by them actually, because time and time again, people were putting themselves out. I mean, that's a very inadequate way of putting it, but really putting themselves out in a way that was extraordinary, was unusual, and was, in a sense, was a kind of a gentle rebuke, thinking, actually, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? What am I doing with the graces that I've been given? So it felt like an incredible privilege to be able to visit, be for a short time part of these many groups' lives. I had a wonderful retreat on an Orcadian island with a traditional liturgy. That was wonderful in one way, very different from spending time with Anabaptists near Dover at the other end of the country, but also a wonderful experience.
Roy, where will your travels in radical Christianity take you next, do you think?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I end the book by quoting St. John Henry Newman, "Lead kindly light," and that sense that one step, what is all about one step. One step is enough. It's the Franciscans talk about, how do they talk about it? Traveling without a map, but with the headlights on or something. So that sense that God shines His light into the next bit of the blackness, into the next bit of darkness, but actually seeing where it's going to go further is very difficult. So I my feeling was that actually, to a certain extent, my Wunderlust had been satisfied by this journey, and that actually I needed to concentrate on what was closer to home. Literally my home, my family, my parish, my work. I did find must say I have found a sort of completion in some ways in working for Mary's Meals. It's such a wonderful charity, not only in what it's doing, but in the way it does it, and in the way that it reaches out to so many different groups and so many different people, but coming from a very strong foundation of faith. That's been a real unexpected. When I finished writing the book, I didn't know I was going to stop teaching and start working for Mary's Meals. That's been a real unexpected joy. So yeah, I'm planning on carrying on doing this for a while.
Well, maybe we'll make a journey over and visit you, Roy, and and our journey will be part of your ongoing journey too. We shall see. But for
That would
now,
be a
we
great
had
pleasure.
better. Yes, well, I certainly intend to get back over to England before too long. And Bobby's just, you can, I don't know, jump on a flight in no time
Quick
to get
flight,
up to
yeah.
London from Poland, right?
Hmm.
Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up. The book is called "Travels in Radical Christianity." Roy's writings are all over the internet. You can find them. We'll be sure to point our audience in the direction of your work. Roy Peachey, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you ever so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you both. Thank you.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, we thank you for bearing with us as we've taken a little time off. We've got some more great conversations lined up, and we hope that you'll check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com, to sign up for our emails, follow us on social media, and look out for the next thing that's coming from us. So until next time, God bless you all and live in hope.